Hi, so I'm clearly not Colin. I've seen these slides once this morning at 8:30, so I will try and talk around them. Arable weeds or arable plants, why do they matter? We often look at our habitats in the UK as being ancient or semi-natural. That's how we describe them. And arable plants, in particular, are slightly different from that. Do we value the arable habitat, or do we value the individual species? We already heard this morning from the Welsh Government that they often have that debate. What's more important? Is it the habitat or is it the species? And it's possibly a mixture of both. And we don't really know. But if you take a comparison of, a nice ancient woodland compared to an arable habitat, generally the kind of ancient habitats come out on top. But does that mean that arable land is any less important for our biodiversity? So arable plants are part of an ongoing cycle. They're more appropriately described as disturbed land plants because they will grow on all sorts of habitats. Take red hemp nettle, for example. There are two populations in Wales. They grow on beach shingle, right on the south coast on the Severn Estuary. But if we take the arable habitat, it's part of very much a human cycle that we have brought in with farming. And the two go hand in hand. Every now and then, we talk about land sharing and land sparing. And if you kind of work your way up through academia, you will know that land sharing is where the management and the conservation goes hand in hand, really, with the farming. Often grasslands are described that way. You often need to graze them or have some management of them to maintain the biodiversity. Arable is exactly the same, except that arable wouldn't exist without the impact of man, of humans. And that is the cultivation, the process of ploughing, then sowing, and then, which has also helped to spread some of these plants, allowing that crop to grow with the arable plants there, harvesting, and then resetting the cycle. So if it's broken, what happens? The arable plants tend to disappear. They are the most understudied habitats within the UK and certainly within Wales. And they aren't really recognised for their ancientness. How long have we been growing crops? A very long time. And how long have weed seeds worked their way into those crops? Equally as long. And we have transferred them around. And a lot of our arable plants have been brought here a very long time ago and have since been naturalised. They are also the group of plants that are most under threat across the UK. They're the ones that are declining to a greater extent than any other group of plants. So in Wales, in particular, this is a land use survey, and it's not just arable land, it's disturbed land. But it was done in the 1930s by Dudley Stamp, and if you compare it to the survey done by CCW between 1979 and 1997, there is a 65% decline in arable land, in disturbed ground habitat between those two time periods. I mean, dramatically so. So why has this occurred and what's going? The 1930s are thought of as a low point in history of cultivation, but that's clearly not the case, and it has declined further since. And actually, I find the slide that has been used for the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference quite telling, because if you look at it, most of it is bright green concrete. It doesn't have much diversity in there, and some of our arable land has been reverted to pasture. So it's the pasteurisation of Wales. Why have arable plants declined? It's not just the lack of arable habitat and the lack of cultivation. Seed cleaning has played a big part, particularly for species with larger seeds that can then be taken out. And seeds being transferred in crops have actually kept some of the species going. Things like pheasant's eye. The seeds are quite large, it gets sown in. Corncockle is another one. Those species don't have good seed longevity in the soil seed bank. other species, like poppies, can last for hundreds of years, possibly. I don't think we've ever done an experiment that actually sees how long they can last. So taking out seeds from crops means that these things aren't being spread around anymore, but also the opportunities for them to grow are declining as well, because if the seed doesn't last in the soil, it rots, they're not going to come up year on year. Herbicides. And with the introduction of herbicides post the Second World War, we've seen a massive change in our arable plant diversity. And cultivation. Now, you might think, well, ploughing's ploughing, but actually it's not. There's lots of different types of ploughing, and what you can see here at the bottom is a conventional plough turning over the soil. If you go to parts of the UK now, you will not see that. You will see something called minimum tillage, which is where they spray off the crops and they disturb the very top of the soil, and it's to reduce the weed burden. But also they're using a lot more herbicides. And there are problem weeds. We're not getting around that fact that there are some things that are so prolific that they're causing huge agronomic issues. And then we've got the group of plants that we value. So what do arable plants have relationships with? Soil type in particular. And we categorize at Plantlife soil type into 3 broad categories that are usually cultivated. One is the kind of clay and slowly permeable soils, also called heavy land by the farmers. And generally, it's really hard to work heavy land. You have to look at doing things like autumn cultivation rather than spring cultivation because it's too soggy to get machinery on in the spring. There are a group of plants that are associated with heavy land, things like shepherd's needle and corn buttercup. And if you were to go to Monmouthshire, that's where they exist, and they are almost being wiped out. In fact, there is one population of corn buttercup left to our knowledge in the country, although Julian might tell me otherwise. It's up for housing development, and no one's going to grow, it's not going to survive that. So we could lose another species from Wales, which I think is really disappointing. The second soil type is sandy and free-draining soils. If you were to head down to the Gower Peninsula and over towards Pembrokeshire and south of Ceredigion, you would find that habitat, particularly along the coast. You have things like annual knoll and small-flowered catchfly associated with that. And Wales probably has half of the UK's population of small-flowered catchfly. You can count the number of populations, probably less than 25 in the UK, 25 fields. So these things are really rare. The final type of soil, which we don't have much of in Wales, is chalk and very calcareous soils. Obviously, if you go up to the Great Orme, there's a limestone bit of land there. That's where you might find some, but actually that soil isn't often cultivated. It's more limestone grassland. And arable plants won't come up without disturbance. I'm ignoring the peat soils because hopefully they're not being cultivated anyway, but you never know. Cultivation is changing, as I said, as well. And cultivation has a big impact on the arable plants that will grow. If you have something that's spring germinating, like small flower catchfly, it won't necessarily come up and last through the winter cold period, whereas other things like corn marigold will do. There is a temporal effect on arable plants. What we see is the growing plant. What actually we're trying to conserve is the soil seed bank. That's the thing that we want to come up every year. And it's only survives through regeneration. But even where areas have been grassed over, we could go back and cultivate them, and these plants might come up because the seeds can last a long time for some of the species. We can be very targeted with our work, and if you take some of the work that has been done on arable plants, we know that the prescriptions underneath the agri-environment schemes work. Something like fallow margins is really good for arable plants. You can get up to 25 species, in a 10 by 1 meter strip. Whereas on conventionally managed arable land, you might get 4, mostly docks and something like annual meadow grass. So not great in terms of the diversity there. But we can target where these plants have grown in the past and actually create the conditions to bring them back. So location is also important. But we can only do that where we know that they're growing. And arable land is one of the least surveyed habitats in Wales. And to make sure that we can bring some stuff back and to put these measures in place, we need to get people out there recording. And finally, introductions. So there's two types of introductions. We could look at species that have been recently introduced to the UK, something like Austrian chamomile, which mimics corn chamomile, but it is an introduced species. But we could also look at reintroductions, and taking the case of corn buttercup, we're probably having to look at the last-ditch efforts to save that species in this country of actually trying to collect some seed and grow it on somewhere else, because otherwise it will be gone. So the presumption is that non-crop plants are responsible for yield loss, they're an agronomic problem, and certainly some of them are. There isn't that much of a problem with blackgrass in Wales, fortunately, but there are docks, and there's lots of common couch and various other grass and broadleaved weeds that provide an agronomic problem for farmers, and they don't necessarily want them within their crops. And this is where we go back to the land-sparing aspect. Something like fallow margins works really well, and if it can be targeted alongside crops so that it's done at the same time in terms of the management, it works. But ignoring all arable plants and saying, well, they're all agronomic problems is a bit of a mistake, because they provide many other ecosystem services. So carbon sequestration, soil stability, and also create a green cover over the soil, so they can also help conserve it. In fact, arable plants are so well recognised that their red or arable habitat is so well recognised, it's red listed at the European level. I think it was also included as one of the 5 habitats in the SONA report recently. So it's recognised at a Wales level as well. But it's not often recognised even within the conservation world of what is provided by this habitat and by these species. They also provide much of the diet of invertebrates, and then, of course, seeds for small birds and mammals, who also eat the invertebrates, as the child said so well earlier on. It is a cycle. And they provide pollen nectar for pollinators. It's really telling that there was a study done by CEH, and in the paper produced from it, they noted that bees were actively, well, instead of going to the nicely sown pollinator strips, they were collecting pollen from poppies and bramble. And that just says that there's something, the amino acids contained in the pollen of those species are required by bees to survive. So they're not always just going to go for the sugar hits and perhaps the fast food that can be generated from the pollinator strips. They need the wild plant diversity as well. Going down to the soil, because all sorts of things matter with the soil, the roots and the seed banks support many soil organisms as well, so we can't forget that side of things. We always look at what's growing on the surface rather than sometimes what's underneath too. Thank you. So, just to recap on the public goods, they can help sequester carbon, they can stabilise soil, they can reduce the use of herbicides and particularly pesticides with integrated pest management and bringing things that eat some of the problem species in. And they can increase the abundance of pollinators as well. We have one triple SI for arable plants in the country, and that's at Munt. And that's 6 small fields. And that's it. But it has such a diversity of species in there. And so this is small-flowered cacti. It is small and it has small flowers, and it is sticky, but it doesn't eat flies. So we have to tell children that quite a lot. It's a wonderful plant to see, but most people don't recognise it. It's green, it's boring, it's not as sexy as perhaps some of the birds and some of the mammals that are associated with this habitat. But needless to say, it's really important too. We look at important arable plant areas, and that's how we define where we should go and where we should target arable plant conservation. And so going back to Monmouthshire, this is some of the areas here. The higher the scoring, the more importance it is considered at a county, national or European level. And when you look at Wales, there aren't that many tetrads, so 2 by 2 kilometre squares, that are considered important at a European level. I think there's 3, of which is Munt, and there's one down here in Pembrokeshire. But there's a fair number that are of national importance, and it's something that we should celebrate. So we need to get more people involved. And I think that goes for the conservation community, as well as members of the public, and working with farmers. And we work with a lot of farmers on this. They are really interested, and they do things on a voluntary basis sometimes. It's not all paid through the agri-environment scheme. So we produce certain things to try and help people engage with actually something that they find really difficult to get, because there's lots of plants, and they're all green. So having a little bit of help works. We're developing a new project at the moment. We're running a workshop this afternoon, so we'll be very grateful if people came along and told us what they thought about arable plants and how to do that. And I'm just going to leave you, after the thanks, with one slide. So this is Downy hemp nettle, of which the last plant that was seen in the UK was recorded in 1975 near Bangor. This species, if it's anything like its sibling hemp nettle species, has good seed longevity. It could be brought back if we could cultivate the land. And that's what we need to do to bring some of these back.